Welcome to the Society for American Soccer History's SASH Session with Michael Lewis, author of Alive and Kicking, the incredible but true story of the Rochester Lancers. I'm Tom McCabe, president of SASH, so welcome. Founded in 1993, SASH works to promote, facilitate, and disseminate research into the rich history and heritage of soccer in the United States. You can find us on the web at ussoccerhistory.org and at social media on our Facebook and Twitter accounts. If you'd like to join the society or renew your membership, please visit our website, and you can do so through the Join SASH tab. Before we begin today's session, quick update on a book we featured in a session earlier this year. At last week's North American Society for Sport History conference, it was announced that this book, edited so ably by George Kiosis, our treasurer here at SAS, and Chris Bolzman, Soccer Frontiers on soccer in the United States before 1913. It won the first prize for best anthology. Almost every chapter was authored by a SASH member here on the live call. So congratulations to George and Chris and to all those who contributed. A major accomplishment in the scholarship for American soccer history, and a definite link to SASH. Now back to our guest today. Michael Lewis has covered the Lancers during the 1970s and the 1980s for the Rochester Democrat and Chronicle. He documented the ups and downs, the twists and turns of Rochester's only major league sports franchise. He'll tell us more about that story in the moments to come. But Lewis's life in soccer didn't end with the NASL's demise, as he's covered World Cups, Olympic Games, the arrival and survival of Major League Soccer. Up until 2021, he's attended every single MLS Cup final. He maintains and writes for the website Front Row Soccer, and he has written several other books on soccer. As his Twitter profile proclaims, suggests, if it happened, he was probably there. So he's been eyewitness to American soccer history for decades now, and we're really thrilled to have him here today to talk about his new book, Alive and Kicking. We'll have Michael first talk about the book project. He's on a book tour right now in Rochester, of all places, and then we'll open up the session for Q&A. So Michael, welcome, and the floor is now yours.
Tom, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you everyone for being aboard on this Zoom call. Before I get into the book itself, I want to give you a little background about myself on how I got to cover the Lancers. Growing up, I always enjoyed O. Henry's work, the irony of everything. And it's pretty ironic that I wound up writing a book about the Lancers that I really didn't want to have anything to do with covering them early on. About 2-3 weeks into my first job ever in Rochester, it was a slow Wednesday night at the Rochester Democrat and Chronicle, and myself and another writer, Tom Fitzgerald, were given a very long dinner break. And the Lancers were playing the Italian National Army team that night at Holleder Stadium. Maybe some old NASL fans or Cosmos fans might remember a rickety old stone stadium that was surrounded, the field was surrounded by a snow fence to keep the fans out. We go to the game, and just before halftime, there's a pitch invasion by about 200 fans, and they attacked the home team. I had never seen anything like this before. I said to myself, I'm glad I don't have to cover this motley crew. What a headache and a half. And during the season, they had a coach that was fired when the team was in first place. The owner took over the team, coaching it for one game. They lost 7-1, and I said, this is a train wreck. So like DNC has me cover high schools early on, which is fine with me, bottom man on the totem pole, and I enjoy doing that. About 6 months later, January 1975, I'm called over to the desk of assistant editor Bill Parker. He has a pile of files, and he asks me, well, he actually tells me, you know, we think you're doing well. And he starts talking about soccer and about the Lancers. And I'm thinking, oh no, my worst fears are going to be coming to fruition. And basically he says at the end of it, and I don't remember anything that he says because I'm thinking, you got to be kidding me. He pushes over a bunch of files to me and says, congratulations, you're covering your first professional sports team. And all I wanted to do is push it back. No, thank you. But hey, I'm a rookie writer. I'm still under probation. They had a year probation then. My first job, and in sports writing, any job is a dream job, especially your first job. Can't say no. I wound up learning about the sport. I had some great mentors on the newspaper, outside of the newspaper. And here I am almost 5 decades later, covering the game and writing a book about the team. Okay, that's my beginning of my soccer writing background. I learned how beautiful the beautiful game is, how much I enjoyed it, meeting different nationalities, learning what it was like around the world, getting a chance to travel, maybe on someone's own buck instead of my own. And you wonder, why a book about the Rochester Lancers? Well, with all due deference to the New York Cosmos, there were other teams around back in the 1970s and 80s in the North American Soccer League. And after covering the Lancers, and they had so many incredible adventures on and off the field, I figured, got to tell the world about this. And this is something I wanted to do way back in the 70s. But as we all know, I think all of our projects, or most of our projects, are always put on the wayside, on the back burner, because we have to earn money to pay the mortgage, the rent, and whatnot. So I wanted to do this for years. And I decided about 10, 12 years ago, I am finally going to write this thing. And it took 10, 12 years to compile it to be as concise as I could. You know, one thing that I was influenced by is I've been to England 15, 16 times, and I could not believe some of the histories of the various clubs that they have there. The largest clubs, and even clubs that maybe don't even exist anymore. And I took a look at some of those books, and I said, this is incredible. And I figured, I think every team in the United States, every soccer team in the US should have its own history written. And that's another reason why I decided to pursue the book. I have to admit, the book is very detailed. It gets into the weeds, as I like to say. It details every game, even with times of the goals of the team. I figured that the Lancers had such a roller coaster ride. If I just wrote about this crazy thing happened and this crazy thing happened, there is no context between all this. You needed to talk about the games, the winning streaks, the losing streaks, the crazy stuff that happened in the locker room. After one of the games, they won 1-0, and Mike Stoyanovich, their striker, their star striker, and the assistant coach were fighting. They had to be held back. And the assistant coach told Stoyanovich, you should have scored more goals. Because at the time, if you remember, the NASL had a point scoring system where a team would get a point for every goal scored up until 3. So the assistant coach felt the Lancers lost a couple of extra points. I saw this fight happening. And when I say a fight, it wasn't, there were no punches thrown, but there was a hell of a war of words. And it was almost like a Tower of Babel in there with all the various languages happening. Again, they're fighting after a win. It's almost like, I guess, the old Bronx Zoo of the New York Yankees. A lot of interesting characters on this team. Charlie Scianna, one of the owners, was a member of the city council. He was the lone Republican on the city council. His nickname was Lonesome Charlie. He wound up coaching the Lancers 3 times. He had a winning record, believe it or not. Was the general manager of the team, and he also did soccer radio analysis as well too. So talk about someone who was wearing a lot of hats. Very controversial guy. We didn't always get along, as you could probably guess, because I was writing about some of the of that roller coaster ride with the Lancers. But believe it or not, now we get along very, very well. I think he's very happy that I wrote about his team. But I just thought it was important to talk about this team and maybe to teach the new generation that it's not all about MLS and these great, fantastic stadiums. Back in the day, teams were barely getting by. They did not have billionaire owners. A lot of teams didn't have billionaire owners. The Lancers, for the most of their existence, were owned by local people who were well-to-do, and they were essentially a community team. They had barbecues at the homes of their owners. Think of that happening today, maybe in the USL, perhaps, but MLS, no. And I think, you know, again, this is North American Soccer League, first division in the United States. And this is what it was like way back in the day. And besides that roller coaster ride, the Lancers did have some significant history that helped save soccer in this country. Back in 1969, they joined the North American Soccer League, which had only 4 teams after that season. And there was no way that they could call themselves a national soccer league with only 4 teams. So Clive Toy, Lamar Hunt, they visited Rochester, did some convincing. I think there was an interesting back and forth negotiations that happened at a motel at O'Hare Airport. And the Lancers joined the league, and so did the Washington Darts. And that gave the NASL 6 teams, which was a life preserver, at least. But you just imagine if there was no NASL, you just wonder how soccer would have grown since then. Would have there been a team in New York to have Pelé, who helped seed what was youth soccer back then, what we see today? Perhaps it would have happened anyway, we don't know. Speaking of history, the Lancers also played in the longest soccer game ever in US soccer history, 176-minute marathon. They didn't have overtime in the 1971 playoffs, so they played until a team scored. A minute before midnight in September 1971, Carlos Meditieri scores to give the Lancers a 2-1 victory over the Dallas Tornado in the 1971 semifinals. So a lot of history there as well too. You know, like it or not, as the NASL grew, the Lancers could not keep up. And when Pelé came into the league, which there was a big deal about it in Rochester, when Pelé showed up, they would fill up Holleder Stadium. But the problem was they were getting millionaires into the buying into the league. Lancer owners were not millionaires. Like I said, they were well-to-do. And like it or not, the league started to move ahead of the Lancers, and you could probably guess there were more adventures. I'm not going to go specifically into them unless you ask me about it, but I guess I'll leave it at that for now. So.
Thank you very much, Michael, and we'll open the floor. Since I have the mic, I'm going to ask the first question. Historians are always interested in source material, and oftentimes there are not a whole lot of sources to tell our stories. So my first question is this: what did you use to tell this tale decades later. I'm assuming a personal archive, other work. So how did you tell these stories surrounding the Lancers?
Yeah, it's I think as historians, I think we all like to learn how everyone dug up things. Yes, personal archives, way back in the day when I first started out, when there were real newspapers, I had a clip book and I put every story I had in, no matter what I covered, big or small. I was that excited and proud of it. And I had the 6 years I had covered the Lancers, I had every story I covered. And not only that, other people's stories too, so I could do some research. When Charlie Schiano was talking to me when we were on good terms, he gave me his scrapbook collection of the team from 1967 to 1976. Late at night at the Democrat and Chronicle, I don't know if I should be saying this, they might charge me for this now, but I went to the copy machine in the wire room and just made copies of all his stories in there. I just said, I'm going to need this someday. And I think maybe, like I said, back then I had this inclination of writing a book. Went to the Rochester Public Library, microfilm, to fill in some gaps, because even as copious a collection as Charlie had, there were still some things that needed to be filled in. I think a big deal was newspapers.com a number of years ago, where beyond Rochester stories, I got an opportunity to look at other newspapers, to see other renditions of games, maybe a quote from a player that would be perfect for a story. And I'll tell you this, I still feel like I'm still missing some things, believe it or not. And there were obviously interviews beyond when I covered the team. I started talking to players in the early 2000s. I spoke with Dave Saragin, who wound up being the interim U.S. national team coach in about 4 or 5 years ago. Spoke to him in 2001 about some of his adventures with the team. And he, sometimes at the time, players aren't going to tell you stuff on the record way back in the 1970s, but years later, hey, the team can't fine them or fire them or anything like that. And I'll tell you a little thing about Dave. Dave was a Rochester boy. He lived at home while playing for the Lancers. He was making, get this now, $80 a week. That's right, $80 a week. But of course, when you're living at home, maybe you might not feel like a millionaire, but you feel a lot better. Anyway, the team goes to Team Hawaii. They lose 4-1. They play horribly. Dave winds up playing the last 12 minutes of the match or so off the bench. And as I said about the team not being in great financial shape, the management decides to fine the entire team a week's salary, or $200. Unfortunately, the next time there was a paycheck, Dave opens it up and he doesn't see his check. He sees a thing that says, you owe us $120. So he had to wait for his next paycheck for that to go through. There was not a players union back then. That would have been one incredible case at the time. I think today it would be a hell of a scandal, but he was able to tell me that story way back in 2001. And I wound up talking to other players, obviously, through the years, getting new stories, double checking things. And slowly but surely it came together. And thank God for computers. When I first started in this business, there were typewriters. With computers, you could add stuff, move things around. I mean, and that has helped tremendously as well too. So I've always looked at myself as a journalist, as a scavenger, and and the same thing as an author too. You can take a little from here, a little from there, and you never know what you're going to find. Sometimes you stumble into stuff. All of a sudden, someone's finds me on the internet and says, hey, I have this old story you might want to be interested in. And that's how this whole thing came together. And I've got to straight, I would not be surprised if a lot of the people who are on this maybe shaking their heads. Yeah, all this sounds familiar. You know, you take what you could find. And it's funny because when I was putting the finishing touches to this book, I told my wife, Joy, who edited it, I said, I know there's other material out there, but I got to finish this thing or this thing will never get published. So I know you gave me a short question, but there's a long story and long answer.
Love it. We all, you know, are brethren in those stories in and around source materials. David Kilpatrick got the next question.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think, Michael, you made the mistake about 8 or 10 years ago telling me you were working on this. And so, which again, you know, sometimes a lot of us like to keep these things a little closer to the vest so we don't get pestered. So I'm so thrilled of years of saying, you working on it? How's it going? How's it going? Just so great. And as a kid growing up in upstate New York and Memphis, Tennessee, my grandparents lived in Rochester. I had an uncle named Lance. So I did have a Rochester Lancers pennant on the wall. In my little 1v imaginary friend games, I would often be playing Cosmos against the Lancers. So they were always kind of a team they weren't my team. It was that other end of New York State, but strong connections there. My question is kind of related to that a little bit in that, you know, the first ball game I ever went to wasn't a soccer game, but it was a Rochester Red Wings baseball game. So something that always struck me about the Lancers was that the way in which that did kind of make Rochester, for lack of a better term, a major league town. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about getting that beat with the Lancers, how it, you talk about how it felt a little bit like punishment, but how did that relate to, say, the Red Wings beat or the Americans beat for hockey? You know, the role of the Lancers in town, the dynamic around them. Rochester has become such a great soccer town and has been since then. And also related to that a little bit, you alluded to this a little bit before. To me, this is part of the same question, I hope. That jump from the ASL to the NASL, when Clive was able to get them to make that shift. That wasn't really a conscious, we're going from a second division to first division thing, right? It almost seemed like that was a really big risk they were taking by making sure they filled out the 5 and the 6. So I'm just wondering, in terms of those notions of major league, minor league, first division, second division, and that legacy even of the Rhinos winning an Open Cup and it being such a great town. Just wondering if you could talk about that in terms of major league, minor league, divisional status and what it was like in Rochester at the time.
Well, I'll answer the first question. And if I forget the second question, please remind me. At the time, I would say the Rochester Red Wings were the baseball team was the #1 beat. Then came the Rochester Americans, which I actually wound up covering for 4 years after the Lancers went out of business, which I had a lot of fun doing that as well. And I've learned, enjoy whatever you're covering. But then came the Lancers, and the Lancers at that time, 1975, they were a bit frowned upon because there were rumors every year that they were going to move. There were threats they might move to Buffalo, and there were a number of people who were just tired of that, and they were going through some tough times after having some of their glory years as well. But they got coverage on a regular basis, and the paper gave me the room beyond the news stories, the game stories, to write features. And at that time, and this was an education for me, different nationalities, different situations. So they were getting probably minimal of 5 days a week in the newspapers, and some maybe by the end of their existence, maybe every day in the newspapers, some shape or form, either a news story, feature story, and on a Sunday when they had their home games, multiple stories. I called it NFL coverage, at least at the time. So they, I think, and I give my editors a lot of credit for seeing this, because they had the first and last words of having the of giving a team coverage, but they gave the Lancers their due in their later years, and you know, the crowds were nowhere near what other NASL teams have. Forget about the Cosmos. At the time, the Cosmos were filling up Giant Stadium, but they were getting 7, 8, 9, 10,000 averaging a game, which was very good for this city. So they had grown in stature, and I think near the end, at least, they were getting the benefit of the doubt by the media in their coverage. I think the Lancers ownership wanted more coverage because they were Major League. It's interesting, by the way, when you mentioned Major League Soccer. In my research, people were calling it, and when they went to the North American Soccer League, Major League Soccer. It was lowercase. It wasn't Major League Soccer as of today. But on your second question again, I'm sorry, the second part of that question.
Well, I guess again, you are kind of addressing that in terms of that leap of faith that they made going from the ASL to the NASL. It wasn't like the ASL thought of itself as second division, right?
Yeah, at the time, I think it was a lot closer. The problem with the ASL, and they had a lot of talented players and a number of very good teams. Some teams were dropping out in the middle of the season. Some teams, and I know the Boston Astros, and they were owned by a very passionate owner. They would, every few games, they would have to move from stadium to stadium because they might not have had the wherewithal or money to pay up, or they found a cheaper venue to play at. And I think the Lancers were getting tired of all these crazy things. One time, the Newark team showed up 2 hours after the fact, after kickoff, and this is before there were cell phones, remember? So it was pay phones calling up and whatnot. And I think the Lancers were getting fed up a bit, again, with the antics, maybe off the field more than on the field. Again, you had some quality sides there. And I think, given the track record of the North American Soccer League at the time, that they had, 18 teams at one time, they looked at it as Major League overall, even though, again, 4 teams does not make a Major League at all. So I think they wanted to move up. When given that opportunity, they felt that they could add something to the league. And for 1970, 71, 72, you could definitely make a case that they were the class of the league. Again, before the Cosmos turned soccer upside down in this country, for the best too, by the way.
Excellent. On to Kevin Tallec Marston, who's got a question.
Thanks, Tom. You can hear me, right, Michael?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Very much looking forward to reading the whole book. I obviously haven't had a chance to read it yet. I have 2 questions. One, which from the description in your book, apparently you talk about, so I was hoping you could expand on that a little bit now, is on the international side of Rochester in 1971. And the second part is more on the ownership side and just the connection between the club and the wider ethnic soccer landscape in Rochester and in the area. So with respect to 1971, obviously, Rochester played in CONCACAF, and I wanted to know if you could just, maybe without giving away everything that's in that chapter, probably in the book, but if you could expand just a little bit more on that, because that's kind of a unique aspect to a lot of the teams at this point, is playing in a competition like that. And I wondered what interesting stories came out of that. And then on the, let's say, the ownership and ethnicity side, from what I gather, you have an ownership group of Italian Americans. Rochester has that interesting demographic bubble where, it hits the high point in the 1950s. and then is starting to tail off. And by the end of the 1970s, you know, Rochester, like, you know, some of the other post-industrial cities, is kind of dipping down, and so people are moving away, and industries is falling. And so I was curious what other connections there were in, you know, how strong the ethnicity was in the ownership group. Particularly, I you know, for example, that you've got, you know, a Ukrainian community that's thriving playing soccer in the 1950s and 60s in Rochester. Was there any mixing there, or, you know, was the Lancers purely a you know, this was the Italian American ownership group, but they didn't necessarily want to make this anything about ethnicity at all?
Very well. Okay, I'll answer your second question first. Lancers' roots come from the Italian American Sport Club. In 1963, Italian American Sport Club, actually they've been around since 1948, and it became more than a sport club. It became more of a community club as well too. But in 1963, the Italian team won the U.S. Amateur Cup after so many years of trying. And from, I'll make a long story as short as possible, from that team came the Lancers. Several members of that team wound up playing for the Lancers in the American Soccer League. The Lancers were not just, yes, they had Italian ownership for the most part, but they also wanted to have as good a team as any. So they were a mixture of different nationalities. Ukrainians, Don Lalka, who was probably their first big American star at the time, a good young player, personal young player who, by the way, helped me out with some interesting stories in the book too. And they had Germans on the team, Brazilians as well too, Uruguayans. It was a mixture. It was, I know it's a cliche, you know, United Nations lineup, but that's what they had well before it became that so-called cliche. So it was an interesting mixture. And in fact, over the years, they had less and less Italians on the team. It was just trying to get the best players possible. During the later years, they had, well, at that time it was Yugoslavian. They were called Yugoslavians. Now we'd call them Serbians and Croatian players on the team, plus Portuguese. And again, anyone who could play the game and maybe not demand a ridiculous salary as well too. So it was an interesting, I guess you had to start somewhere. And at the time, in the Rochester District Soccer League, you had teams, you know, the Italian American Sport Club, the Ukrainian Americans, the German Americans. It was, you know, ethnic teams. And from those teams came a player or two to join the Lancers or try out for the Lancers. Because I think the owner, again, those owners realized you can't rely on just one nationality. In answer to your first question, boy, I wish I could have been alive to see the Lancers play in CONCACAF, because they were the first American professional team to play there. I know Elizabeth, an amateur team that played there, played in the competition, the CONCACAF Champions Cup a year prior. But yes, the Lancers had some intriguing adventures there. After they were eliminated from the 1971 playoffs, yes, even though they did win that 176-minute playoff game, they wound up losing the series to the Dallas Tornado, losing, by the way, in the third game, a 148-minute game. I'm not trying to get sidetracked there. About a month later, Lancers have to head for Bermuda to play Pembroke. And well, in their first game, they win 4-0, no problem. Second game, yeah, it was a problem playing on a home field, and Pembroke winds up tying the game, or tying the series, and it's all tied up at 4. And there comes a big moment in the game when Roberto Leonardo falls on the ball by accident. The fans are yelling for a handball. Referee doesn't see it. And I guess the Lancers are now saying, thank God there is no such thing as VAR at that time. They go down on a break, shoot, score, and they wind up winning the series 5-4. There were no away goal rules or anything like that. It was total goals. They ran into their locker room, and the fans were peeved, obviously, on what had happened, and they're not knocking on the door, thumping on the windows, that sort of thing, until the police got them away, and the Lancers were able to return to their hotel. So that was an adventure and a half just from that. They wound up that got them into the final series in Guatemala City in March. And if you know anything about the weather in Rochester in the wintertime, and I lived up here for 10 years, and sometimes things didn't thaw out until April, how in the hell do you practice outdoors when there's snow on the ground? And players at that time would go return to their home country too. They wouldn't return to the United States. And I'm talking about all soccer players playing in the North American Soccer League. They wouldn't return until right before the season. Now Lancers have to play in March, and they're not used to playing in March. So they wind up training indoors at a high school gymnasium, and they go into this competition without playing any exhibition games, without playing any outdoor games. And I give them a lot of credit. It was a 6-game round robin type tournament. And the Lancers, I think, did quite well. I'll try not to give too many of the crazy stories off the field. But they finished in 4th place. They went 2-1. That was 2 wins, 2 losses, and 1 draw. And when you look at it, for a North American team at the time, from a country that had not qualified for the World Cup in 22 years at the time, that was quite an accomplishment. And yes, there were some interesting, I'll try not to take away some of the surprise in the book, but there were some interesting incidents before games and interesting games, some funny moments. Some players decided to leave the hotel one night, and they walk into a hotel, and who's there? Walks into a bar, and who's there but the owner and the trainer of the team? Oops, they're in trouble. But at that juncture, they couldn't afford to get rid of any players. But all things considered, they did quite well and acquitted themselves well, again, for a team that had not even had any outdoor practice sessions, which is mind-boggling.
A quick follow-up question from the chat. Stephen Torres, considering that success of the Lancers in 70-71, why didn't other NASL clubs follow in their footsteps and compete in the Champions?
I'm trying to remember the exact reason why. I don't want to give false information. I think at the time, I think the league or the teams just did not want to maybe potentially embarrass themselves at the time. Maybe they did not have enough confidence in that they could do well. I think the Cosmos would have done incredibly well myself. I'll say this: after the Lancers beat Pembroke from Bermuda, Phil Woosnam and some of the NASL owners weren't very happy about the fact that the Lancers were going to compete in Guatemala. And at one of the NASL meetings, one of the Lancer owners, Pat Dinolfo, who was, I guess, if you called Charlie Schiano the bad cop, Pat Dinolfo was the good cop. He did not make much noise or controversy. He was so mad at the rest of the NASL Board of Governors, he took a chair and threw it against the room, because he said, "There's no way you're going to stop the Lancers from competing in the CONCACAF Champions Cup." So anyway, my gut feeling is I think teams were afraid of not playing well. in it after the
Ne-
Lancers.
Thank you. Next question goes to club historian of Chicago House, Chuck Carlson.
Can you hear me? I
Yes,
always
I
have to
can.
check on the technology. Michael, thank you very much for your presentation, and I also am certainly looking forward to reading the book. It sounds great. My question is also related to the ownership group. Were they true believers in soccer and wanting to spread the gospel of the greatest game? And then secondly, you mentioned the UN nature of the team. Can you talk a bit about the North American players beyond Saracen that played for the Lancers? Thank
Sure.
you.
The owners, they they got their soccer bug watching the 1966 World Cup. And they were excited about it, just like so many other fans and owners throughout the country. And that's why they decided to join the American Soccer League. They knew at the time Rochester wasn't big enough. They didn't have enough money to join the NASL, obviously. So they were passionate about spreading the, as you said, the gospel. And, yes, the Lancers owners want to make money on the team. Sure, they did. But all they wanted to do was just break even and have a successful team in Rochester forever. That's all they wanted. Again, if they had a pocket, a couple $1,000s, they wouldn't mind it. But they lost a lot of money through the years, and God bless them for doing it. And it's funny because the first word of the book of the first chapter, the first word is passion. I talk about the passion of the players who played for the Italian American sport club, and I think that also is a underlying theme throughout the book for some of the for all of the owners. They cared about this team because it was in their own backyard too. Like I said, they had barbecues with the players. They wanted to see it succeed in so many ways possible. And they never thought about getting rich from it. As for the other North American players, yes, they had quite a few. By the way, unfortunately, Dave didn't get an opportunity to play that much with the Lancers. They had the Americanization rule at the time, and I don't have it in my mind how many there was. By the time the NAS, by 1980, I think you needed 4 or 5 North American citizens on the team. But by then, Dave had left the team. Dave actually established himself professionally indoors, and that helped save his career. But going back to some of the top North American players, Jim Pollahan, a forward from Quincy College out in Missouri. Basically, Don Popovich, the coach at the time, actually we called him Dragon in the story, in our game stories and our feature stories, because it was much better for a headline when you could say Dragon breathes fire after a loss. But Popovich said, listen, I want you to play, but I don't think you're good enough to play as a forward. Could you play as a defender, as a left back? Heck, you're going to play professional soccer? Yeah, you're going to take any position. So Jim Pollahan established himself as a left back, wound up playing for the U.S. men's national team, and had a number of caps. I think he had about 10 or 12 caps. This is off the top of my head. Don Draghi, in 1977, the next year, Lancers drafted him from St. Louis University. He wound up playing at right back and sometimes at center back as well too. And he had a nice long career in the North American Soccer League. And I think he played a little indoors as well too. And Don also played for the U.S. national team as well. Those are the 2 most prominent American players on the team. Because of Rochester's closeness to Canada, they had a number of Canadian players, some naturalized citizens, some born there. Bronco Segota, who had a 20-year career indoors and outdoors. God bless him. Who has a 20-year career these days outside of being a goalkeeper? He's from Toronto. They had an incredible Toronto connection. Pat Urkeley from Toronto. Mike Stojanovic, who was actually born in Serbia, but emigrated to Toronto and played in the Canadian National Soccer League for a number of years. He came from Canada as well too. So an incredible, the team had an incredible connection with Canadian soccer and particularly Toronto soccer as well too. Those are just some of the North American players who made an impact with the team. There are some others, but those are the leading ones. I know, before I forget, because I'm going to get yelled at since he wrote the foreword of the book, Shep Messing played a year with the team in 1979. And what made this unique was that Shep didn't live in Rochester at the time. He continued to live in Roslyn, New York on Long Island, and he commuted to Rochester for games. And I think you're probably thinking, he did what? He hardly practiced with the team unless it was a day before the game or maybe on away games. All things considered, the defense wasn't the problem with the team. I mean, they had a very good defense at the time, but we all know Shep, a character at the time, and today a respected announcer of New York Red Bull games. But it's funny, I think we were waiting for the defense to collapse, to Shep Messing to make a crazy error, and he never did, or at least I don't remember that. And I give him a lot of credit, but man, what an experiment that had to be, not, working with your defense. But they almost made the playoffs too, but that's another story. You'll have to read the book on how they didn't make the playoffs.
We've gone through our first round of questions. We might have some follow-ups, but before we do that, how can we get the book? The best place to go? Some details about that.
Yeah, this is a self-published book, and unfortunately, there's the only place to go is Amazon.com. And yeah, some people might say, they might not be thrilled about paying Amazon. I tried to get a special coupon, and unfortunately, I can't do it for Amazon books. That's just the way their rules are at the moment. However, I'm willing to give all SASH members $4 off. If you'd like to purchase a book through me, you could still purchase it through Amazon, but it'll be postage will be taken care of by me. You could send it to my email address, sockwriter, that's SOCWRITER @AOL.com, and we could work out a payment method as well too. But I'm willing to do $4 off. I can't do that coupon on Amazon. I'm a little disappointed on that. It would make life a lot easier for everyone. Thank you, Tom.
Any other follow-up questions? We'd love to keep this at an hour because we know Michael is on a book tour, and we'll be speaking about the book for hours to come. So we want to preserve his voice, one of the leading voices in American soccer history. We want to preserve that. Any other questions, follow-up questions you'd like to throw?
Yeah, if I may, just you alluded to this a little bit. Shep with that long commute. You mentioned Branko Segota, Stojanovic, that wild experiment that went the other direction with the outdoor Lancers kind of morphing into the New York Arrows. I wondered if you could just talk about that. How was the reception to that upstate, especially as the Arrows became such a phenomenon? And to what degree did perhaps the Buffalo Stallions maybe infringe upon the Lancers' popularity towards the tail end as well?
All things considered, I think the Arrows-Lancers connection worked out well in that it gave players an opportunity to make more money because they weren't making a lot of money at the time. Jim Pollahan, the best North American, was making maybe $19,000. and now he could almost double that. Yes, he had to play more and maybe expend more energy and have less time between seasons. But as we all know, soccer seasons are 10 months these days, not 6 months. Although the transition from indoor to outdoor was an interesting one. I'll give you an example. In New York Arrows, 1979, they win the first major indoor soccer league championship in Philadelphia at the Spectrum. A week later, they return to the same block at Veterans Stadium, the Lancers do, with many of the Arrow players, to play the Philadelphia team, Philadelphia Fury. Yeah, they lost that game like 2-0, 3-0. They didn't play well. They just looked like a band that the instruments were playing on their own tune. It took them a while to get used to playing with one another. Yeah, you can't transition from the indoor game to the outdoor game in 1 week. They eventually did that season, and like I said, they made a playoff run. I think in the long run, I think the fans up there welcomed the fact that the Lancers were able to play indoors because they could follow them. The players could make a living, and also at least they had a championship team to play for. I called the Arrows the Lancers South. Some people didn't like that back on Long Island. And then some Lancers wound up playing for the Baltimore Blast, which I called them the Lancers Deep South. And then the Buffalo Stallions, they had some Lancers on their team as well too. And I loved it as a writer because it gave me an excuse to see indoor soccer during the winter and cover the game. And I called them Lancers West. And I mean, obviously, I always said Buffalo Stallions first, but always having a little fun with things. And I'll tell you this, the rivalry between the Buffalo Stallions and the Arrows was second to none in that league. Players knew each other. They were teammates. Maybe they weren't always happy being teammates with one another, but it was a fierce rivalry. Some of the craziest indoor games I've ever encountered and wrote about. And as a writer, the crazier, the better. I'm glad the Stallions were around for so many years. It made, at least from a writing standpoint, a lot of fun for me. So I think it upped the rivalry and the intensity of the game.
Excellent. We are right at an hour mark. We want to thank you for joining us. All the best with the book tour events, this weekend and in the future. And we really want to thank you for joining us here at SASH. And we'll do our best to spread the word about this really important club history. And as you said at the outset, we need more of these. I know we have some club historians on the call. Others will watch the video, but they can walk in your footsteps and contribute to the American soccer scape. So thank you, Michael. All the best with the book tour.
Listen, thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it. Listen, good luck to everyone out there who's writing their own books. I'm going to be looking forward to listening to your chats, Zoom chats in the not too distant future. Thank you again.